big techno fest, not my preferred ground, but I feel very looked after. Thank you, John and Sebastian. I trained as a body psychotherapist initially some time ago, and for about 25 years, I've been working most exclusively with men and teenage boys. About 20 years ago, this time of year, I was heavily involved in ritual work, and a friend of mine said, "I'm going to the cenotaph for Remembrance Day. Do you want to come with me?" And I was like, "Well, it's jingoistic rubbish." And he said, "Oh, I thought you'd like it." He said, No. That was really where I stood. But over the next few years, I found myself on Remembrance Day drawn to the cenotaph in Leeds, where I live, and sobbing uncontrollably and wondering what the hell's going on with me. I don't have any conscious connection with this stuff at all. I don't understand it. And yet something big is happening. So that kind of prompted me into an exploration of my ancestry, my attitudes to war, and my attitudes to grief. And it's an ongoing, fruitful discussion, somewhat heightened at the moment by, well, more than heightened by the stuff in Ukraine, by the stuff in Europe. And it's brought it very much to the boil for me. So it's a great opportunity, I think, for us to explore what this multifaceted, frightening as hell, deadly thing is we're confronted with. And so we've got 2 hours, so no pressure. That's what we can do.
So one thing I think we've both been increasingly aware of is that the experience of war and the archetypal experience of war is as much a part of the female experience as it is a part of the male experience. So we're delighted and very pleased to have some women with us this afternoon, and we'd like to explore the female experience of war too. Over time, Simon and I have both worked with medicine teachers, shamans of one sort or another, and they have the extraordinary views on war and warfare. And having worked with returning warriors in my case, and it became apparent that they were often right when they say that when we go to war, we leave some little piece of our soul behind. It's a bit like a car hitting a wall. When you come away, there's a little bit of you left in the wall. And that was very much my experience working with some returning soldiers, both with Simon and apart. And I became acutely aware that there was some deep experience that is to do with retrieval of the soul and returning the soul. So that's a theme that's been there in my work. And I'm a poet, but I also do ritual. And what I became aware of was that this recurring theme of leaving the soul behind and needing to recover the soul is a very deep theme in our culture, and is one that isn't really explored. Yeah.
And what is kind of deeply scary and fascinating about that is it doesn't seem to have to be just us who have left our soul behind. We may not have served, but we may well have ancestors from our past who did serve and did have their experience there. And that was very much my experience. So part of our work is to look at where the ancestral lines link up, and what we may still be carrying for our families 3 or 4 generations later, which has been unexpressed. Give you a flavour. William spoke of medicine teachers. One man that was very important for both of us, I think continues to be so, is a man called Martin Prechtel, who's a shaman from the Mayan tribe in Guatemala, and he speaks about war's absolute need to mix with grief. He says war only reoccurs because we cannot grieve. I'll read what he wrote in a wonderful book called The Smell of Rain on Dust, around grief and war. He says, war is an enormity of sorrow, looking for new blood to pay the overwhelming debt of ungrieved blood from the previous war. A new war declared at any level is what happens when all those involved cannot, will not, or are not allowed to grieve the sorrows and terrible losses of the previous generations of war. So he's saying if we can't grieve, war will happen again and again and again. As it tries to reclaim its debt, as it tries to reclaim its debt. That gets quite radical, because if we think about that, and Martin is quite explicit about it, if we are not grieving, we are kind of complicit in war. If we are not grieving, if we're not in touch, at least with our grief, we are some way in complicit with war.
Yes.
That's a big one to chew. That's a big one to chew.
Yes. And that complicity is something that we'll be coming to a little bit later. And I think it's another one of these themes, seams that runs through our experience of war. I'm going to read a couple of poems now. When we think of war and we think of poetry, we tend, certainly in our culture, to leap straight away to the war poets. So I'm going to begin with a poem by Wilfred Owen. It's not one of the horror poems, and there are horror poems. It's a quieter poem altogether. And I wanted to read it because it's about war at a distance, in a way. It's about thinking about war after the war. It's a poem called Anthem for Doomed Youth. What passing bell for these who die as cattle? Only the monstrous anger of the guns. Only the stuttering rifles' rapid rattle can patter out their hasty orisons. No mockeries now for them, no prayers, nor bells, nor any voice of mourning save the choirs, the shrill, demented choirs of wailing shells and bugles calling for them from sad shires. What candles may be held to speed them all? Not in the hands of boys, but in their eyes shall shine the holy glimmers of goodbyes. The pallor of girls' brows shall be their pall, their flowers the tenderness of patient minds, and each slow dusk a drawing down of lines. I like that last line. It's a poignant remember for me of an old practice in the village I came from, which was when anyone died, the household would draw the blinds. I don't know if you have that experience. It's still common some places, but other places it seems not to be there. Here's a poem by Robert Bly, who led many of us to a different way of looking at the world. This is a poem about coming home, what happens once again after war, at that distance from war. Many of us worked with men who've been traumatized, and it's worth remembering that not all men, not all people, seek help. This is a poem called The Russian. The Russians had few doctors on the front line. My father's job was this. After the battle was over, he'd walk among the men hit, sit down and ask, would you like to die on your own in a few hours, or should I finish it? Most said, don't leave me. The two would have a cigarette. He'd take out his small notebook. We had no dog tags, you know, and write the man's name down, his wife's, his children, his address, and what he wanted to say. When the cigarette was done, the soldier would turn his head to the side. My father finished off 400 men that way during the war. He never went crazy. They were his people. He came to Toronto, my father, in the summers, would stand on the lawn with a hose, watering the grass that way. It took a long time. He'd talk to the moon, to the wind. I can hear you growing, he'd say to the grass. We come and go. We're no different from each other. We are all a part of something. We all have a home. When I was 13, I said, Dad, do you know they've invented sprinklers now? He went on watering the grass. This is my life. Just shut up if you don't understand it. A lot of people carry the war with them in a very real way, and they try to express it. They try to squeeze out the grief in their own different ways. One grief I've become aware of recently is the grief of refugees, people, the estimated 10 million people who have left Ukraine in the last year. This is a poem for them, and for us too, as we welcome them or not, as the case may be. The poem is called Things to Carry With You as You Leave the Ruins. First, bring your careful animal body to test the ground as it shifts beneath you. Your 6 strong senses to get you through the night, the sinew and muscle you took for granted, your red raw hands, your gut, your heart, the wrathful snarl which shook you once, but now like a tiger could save your life. Next, at the sweetness of all that is gone. The gallery of smiles, the faded images, from the dog-eared scrapbooks of tribe and kin, left in a corner, long forgotten, the silly songs, the half-remembered melodies, the tired jokes and indulgent groans, the lingering imprint of a hand on your cheek, a tender reminder of your attendant dead, and the kindness in those who did such harm. Remember the smell of your own rich soil, the scent of its trees, their leaves and needles, the stones you kicked that seemed to have no value, but now you give gold to hold in your hand. And as you hear the rumble of distant collapse, far away and fading as you take your leave, be mindful too that there was once a joy in every waking and every morning that you were witness to, albeit unaware, that you were at home in your part of the world, that you were beloved of the spirits of place. Hmm.
Mm.
Yeah.
Yeah. Thanks, William. So, in Martine's words, we need to, we are bound to stop feeding the war by getting more in touch with our grief. Because it seems like through epigenetics tells us that this stuff gets passed down anyway. We can't avoid it. Silence can't avoid it. And so maybe it behooves us to explore what our ancestry is around war, where we may be carrying a wound, where it might affect us today.
Yes. Mm.
So for in my case, for example, when I first started getting moved by the cenotaph and so forth, my anxiety symptoms started to increase exponentially. And I worked with them. And as I worked with the symptoms, what I saw around me was a battlefield. And I find myself flinching and ducking and diving and hiding and terrified if I amplify it. Now, I've never been on a battlefield, so to speak, but my grandfather had, and he was very badly injured in World War I. And I found out more about him and his story as I explored my own wound. So we're going to invite you to step into small breakout rooms in a moment of about 3 or 4 people each, depending on the numbers. Take some time to, and we have the questions in the breakout rooms, take some time to say who you are, introduce yourself, where you've come from, and what was your first experience of war? Was it on TV, in a comic book? Did you serve? Have you served? Did your parents or family serve? How was that? How did it feel? And if you did bring a photograph of an ancestor or a family member affected by war, introduce them. Who are they? What happened to them? And we'll come back to that a bit later on. If we have the time. But bring them into the room, bring them here. We would also invite you to step out of ideas more into feelings, and do that carefully, because we're talking about some big, big unexpressed feelings.
Yes.
So just be aware of that. That would feel right. Well, anything else to say before we move into breakout rooms?
No. If you didn't bring a photo, bring someone to mind. You might want to think of and name a relative or somebody who experienced war, that you know experienced war, and you might want to name them and to honor them, but also to bring them into the room. We'll be returning to this theme of the photograph later, but for the moment, it's about naming them and bringing them present. So it's going to take about 5 minutes each, I imagine, and we'll call you back at the end of that.
So it'll be about 20 minutes in total as we've changed around and taken our 5 minutes or so.
Great. Thank you very much indeed. Sebastian's going to pop you into a room now.
Thank you.
Okay, for 20 minutes. Opening rooms in 3, 2, 1.
So we're coming back into the main room. Now I think William and Simon, we might have you on mute. So I think you, yes. Are you both?
Unmute.
Yeah. So let's see.
Yes, there we are. Perfect.
And Simon,
Great.
you're still on mute.
Okay.
That's
Perfect.
great. Thank you.
Okay. Welcome back, everybody.
Yeah. We'd like to very briefly hear from everybody. 1, 2, maybe 3 words. Just a quick weather report of how are you doing? 1, 2, or 3 words.
Who'd like to go? Unmute yourself and go.
Here at last.
Here at last. Thank you.
Good night. Good stuff.
Aware of silence about war in my family.
Yeah.
Words are shock, moved, and opening.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Mine are wondering about mystery.
Mystery. Aha. Interesting.
Mine are too many secrets.
Mm.
Wow.
Yeah.
Grief and trauma.
Yeah.
I think conflicting words of pride and shame.
Mm.
Oh, interesting. Yeah. I could see that. Yes.
Well, that made me tear up, that one.
Yeah.
I think mine is a mystery and many unknowns.
Okay. Thank you.
Okay.
Right. The word trauma came up there, for which many thanks. I was working a little while ago. In the break, we were talking about the work that we're doing, just for that moment. And I was working with a group of Israelis for an Israeli company in New Jersey, of all places. And it was all a bit New Jersey. And everyone was really wounded. There's no two ways about it. And I worked with them. Then the next time I worked with them in Israel. And it transpired that every one of this group, they were all the grandchildren of the Holocaust. And what they experienced was that their grandparents did not talk about their experience of the Holocaust to their children, to anyone. So their parents were unable to talk about the family experience to them. And everything was locked up and locked in. There was a lot of anger, huge amount of anger, and a great deal of grief, but it was all locked in their bodies. And I became acutely aware. And it wasn't until we began to find ways to unlock this third generation trauma that we were able to help these people at all. And it took a lot of work, but it was very rewarding. And the word that came up again and again for me was epigenetics. So I know that Simon's got some really interesting thoughts around epigenetics.
Well, thank you. Nothing very original, but quite astonishing stuff. When I was trying to explain what was happening to me, what I felt, and I never heard of epigenetics. This is about 20 odd years ago, 15 years ago. In the eyes of my indigenous teachers, it was completely normal.
Yes.
You are carrying ancestral pain from your grandfather, from your grandfather's father, because those men suffered and did not talk about it, did not grieve. And for whatever reason, you are now the chosen delegate of that family line. And you can choose to carry on saying nothing about it, or you can choose to speak out and try and heal this family hurt. And I spoke to my dad about this because it was my paternal grandfather who was very badly injured in World War I on barbed wire. And my dad said that his dad, my grandfather, again, that much vaunted phrase, would never talk about it.
Yeah.
Never talk about it. And they were one of the first families in their street to get a TV, apparently, because they're a little bit well-to-do. And my dad said as soon as TV arrived, that was it. My granddad dived into the TV and would speak even less. Really? But carried his trauma with him.
Yeah.
And so my dad said, I lost my father then. That's when I lost him. And for me, I get the same thing. I get the same hand-me-downs. And so when epigenetics comes to the forefront and explains things in a kind of scientific way, I'm delighted and relieved. I think, wow, I'm not mad.
Yes.
And yet this stuff feels, for me, so far from my conscious identity. I think, am I making it up? But everyone around me says, no, you're not making it up. You're having a big effect, a big reaction, response. And I feel it's kind of still fairly much uncharted.
Yes.
In us as a society, as a whole, it's uncharted. And there are some reasons why that is the case, which we'll come on to shortly in our talk. And it's around notions like cowardice and notions like being weak and failing as a man.
Yes.
But more of that to come.
Yes. Thank you. With the passing of the centenary of the armistice, I think that there's been a shift. And what we realize, or what I've realized and what Simon has realized, I think, is that war never leaves us. It's not only in us epigenetically, if we were to say that, it seems to be built into the human psyche and the human experience. And it's important to say that this is true of women as much as it is of men. Historically, women have had a different experience of war, but it's been no less traumatic. That of those who wait behind, it's easy to dismiss as not being in the war, but the women have every bit as much of the experience of war as the men in uniform. The shock, the trauma, the grief still pertains. I'm going to read a poem here that I read to a group of women having written it, and I was absolutely shocked by their response, by their visceral response to the poem. The poem is about the village I grew up in, actually. It's called On the Green. They were rare enough in them days, once in a while to the manor or the vicarage. But on the green, you might never see a telegram from one year's ending to the next, until that morning after Passchendaele. It was late in the year, and a mist hung over the village, wreathing the ponds and the giant elms. A tank engine was panting by the halt, while down at Water End, the very last otter hereabouts lay panting for her mate. I don't know how it fell to him, but the vicar carried them, all of them. Maybe the post office tipped him the wink, though it could have been his sense of duty. So many unable to read a word, telegram or no. I was boiling an egg. My Albert and his brother Wilf had sent my sister Ellen and I an egg cup each from Arras, silver plate with a little coat of arms. We'd taken to boiling an egg once a week, religious-like for luck. I turned the timer and saw the vicar leaving Mrs. Wackett's, moving sharpish for such a big man. I could have sworn he was up to no good, but he was doing his duty by his lights. Next it was Queenie, whose Ted was so good with sweet peas and dahlias. Then Alice, who dropped him the prettiest curtsy. Mrs. Saul, the gamekeeper's wife. Edie Potter, Nellie Weaving, poor old Annie Englefield. Mrs. Wren, whose red velvet curtains were drawn in mourning before he left her gate. Mrs. Jeeves, who offered him tea because he looked so poorly. And Dolly who let the side down, who howled like a vixen and tore at her clothes. The vicar worked his way round the village green, cottage by cottage and woman by woman, wives, mothers, even sweethearts. The vicar always knows who's sweet on who. I was frozen like Alice, stuck in her curtsy, when he turned and walked up our little brick path. By the time he got to Ellen, he was whey-faced and puffing. I wanted to say something kind, but it wasn't a time for kindness. Who'd have thought it, I said by way of conversation. A whole village in one morning. My cup's brass now. The plates wore off with wear. Albert loves his eggs with soldiers. Eats one every day. But Ellen's is as silvery as the day Wilf sent it to her. Two things my sister won't have in her house. The first is eggs. She just can't abide them. The second's any talk of God. Yeah. Mm-hmm. This experience, I think, for women was all the more poignant because they had entered World War One, and we're talking of World War One in this instance, with a very different sense of warfare and what was called for. And like the men, they too became complicit. And as an example of that, I just want to talk about a little thing that happened during the First World War. It wasn't a little thing as it transpired. And that is the notion of the white feather. Now, the way of shaming men into warfare had been common since the Crusades. In the Crusades, white wool was given to men because that was women's work and they were womanish if they didn't go to war. It then became a cockfighting expression. A white feather from the cock was from the cockfight was of the wrong kind of cockfight, the wrong kind of game bird. It wasn't game. That's of course entered into the language too. And then there was this the beginning of World War One. There was a man called Admiral Penrose Fitzgerald. His nickname was Rough. And you get the idea. He had a thing about increasing the number of conscripts. So he got a group of 30 women together in his hometown, focused them, and formed the Order of the White Feather. Their task was to go out into public places and conspicuously give a white feather to men who were not in uniform, who hadn't signed up. Caught on across the country, and thousands of men were shamed into serving, many of whom died, of course, in the vast meat grinder of industrial warfare. I wrote this poem 25 years ago or more, and I'd like to read it now because I realize it is actually for those men who were shamed into serving. It's called Tears on the Drum. We're standing together, my long-lost brother and I, on the sleeping deck of a old and dying luxury liner. We're sharing a fine cigar because we have no jokes. He's talking about the grandfathers who went before. Today, I understand how these proud men, lonely and afraid, could stand up, smiling, in far-off, strange, unhallowed places, with mud on their tongues and tears on the drum. How they could gather to pick sweet poppies, the red, red poppies, and when they were gathered, to walk together into the morning, the misty morning, and die together. We need to weep a while, my long-lost brother and I, but we both know the score. There's never the time. So we wave once more at the distant boats, and we smile, hold hands, and walk down into the water. Yeah.
One of the things that was happening during the First World War was notions of manhood were starting to become challenged.
Yes.
Words like shell shock, not quite PTSD, but shell shock coming onto the vocabulary. And there was a tremendous debate, argument amongst medics, amongst generals, amongst politicians, as to whether a man exhibiting shell shock was really a man or a coward or just ill, or any of those three. And it's quite a pivotal moment. There's a wonderful book here by Pat Barker called The Regeneration Trilogy.
Yeah.
Semi-fiction, semi-non-fiction. And it's all about that process of trying to, can we treat shell shock? how should we look after men who are traumatized? Again, those words weren't used then. The first notions of those ideas.
Yeah.
In the work I do with men, and particularly in the work we do with violent men, there are very strong ideas, both explicit and implicit, about how men should be. How men should be, what makes a real man. And sometimes the results of that inquiry can be absolute carnage, because men feel driven to be a certain way because they're supposed to.
Yeah.
Because that's what a man does. So we'd like to invite you to go back into your breakout rooms and speak about fear and cowardice and grief and weakness in men, in your family, in your ancestry, maybe in you. And how is that? How are you with your own or your other men's fear, other men's weakness, other men's cowardice, perceived cowardice, other men's trauma? How is it for you? Can you support it? Do you have a gut reaction either way? Are you unsure? Explore that, explore it. And it's sensitive, careful stuff. And we're doing this in the spirit of compassionate inquiry.
Yes.
It's not a witch hunt. But take some time to touch this most, I think, one of those crucial drivers of war. So, Sebastian, if we could please have your magic.
Okay. Is it for another 20 minutes?
Yes, please.
Okay.
Could we?
Rooms?
Could I ask that the questions aren't on the screen for too long? Because for most of the time, I couldn't see the people that I was in the group with.
Okay. Good call, Peter. Thank you.
Thanks, Peter.
Opening rooms in 3, 2, 1.
We're all coming back together in the room. Just want to make sure that Simon and William, you've got yourselves unmuted.
Okay, good. Oh,
Yeah.
Okay, are we all back, we think?
Yes, we're all
Thank you.
back.
Great.
Yeah, thank
Good.
you, Sebastian.
Yes, thank you. So look, we'd like to hear from you again, just a few words each about where you're at, where this has left you, how you're doing right now. Just keep it pithy, a few words.
I'll go so fucking complicated.
Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Very raw,
Mm.
Raw.
completely raw. Yeah, I feel like the story where I've been stripped in lime.
Wow.
Mm-hmm.
Full of old tears.
Something about massive theme about choices. When do we have choices? What are the choices? Has kind of come into the conversation.
Mm. Yeah. Thanks for that, yeah. Mm.
I'd say deeply personal.
Common humanity.
Sorry, say again, please.
Common humanity.
Common humanity.
Yeah, yeah. Mm.
Will I fight?
Mm. Good question.
Yeah, yeah. Right. Hmm.
Thank you for that. Any more voices to be heard before we move on?
Okay. Thank you. I'd like to talk, I'd like to just mention a poem. Back at the beginning of my, what do we call it, my journey around this work, I was told to read a book, which I did, and it was called The Road Less Traveled, and I'm sure many of you have come across this book in your time. And interestingly enough, it takes its title from a poem by a man called Robert Frost, who wrote a very famous poem called The Road Not Taken. Now, The Road Not Taken begins, two roads diverged in the yellow wood. And it's about his relationship with a friend, another poet called Edward Thomas. And Edward Thomas was a man who had not written any poetry until he'd met Robert Frost. And Robert Frost kind of prodded him and egged him on and got him to start writing poetry. And he became perhaps one of the greatest of the war poets, though he wasn't published until after the war. So there's something very interesting about their friendship. Frost was an American, and he went home to America. But Edward Thomas was about 35, I believe, and he signed up unnecessarily. And he signed up unnecessarily because he was afraid of his own cowardice. He was afraid that he might not go to war. He was afraid that he might be white-feathered in his own mind. What had happened is that Robert Frost had written a jokey poem about this poem, The Road Not Taken. And it's all about Thomas's inability to make up his mind, whether he goes down one road or another road. And Frost says, well, in the end, it didn't really make any difference. The road, whatever road you take, it's what you get. But Thomas thought it was about something else, and it irked him and it irritated him. And they didn't quite fall out about it, but there was a definite momentary rift. And Thomas went and signed up. He was 35 years of age. He went and joined I think it was the Artists' Rifles or some really strange regiment. But he went and signed up, and suddenly there was this outpouring of poetry that he was writing when he was in these Nissen huts, various different parts of training camps. And he got rid of his indecisiveness. He'd kind of come to some sort of peace with himself. And he went off to war, and he died. He was killed by a shell. And Robert Frost never really forgave himself for that. And the poetry deepened and darkened because he'd lost a very dear friend. And of course, that's another aspect of war, is that we lose friends, not just family, not just historical, but we do lose friends. And those of us who have lost very dear friends, whether that be in war or otherwise, there's a true loss in that, something that we can sometimes never get over. So Edward Thomas, Robert Frost, well worth looking for the poem, The Road Less Taken. And also worth remembering that this drive to cowardice, not drive to cowardice, the drive away from the perception of one's own cowardice can be a terrible cross to bear. There we are. Simon.
Thank you. So this has been something of a whirlwind lightning tour around the war. We're coming towards the final part, which are notions of healing. We'd like to go back again into your breakout rooms. And if you brought a photo or a memory of an ancestor or a family member that was affected by the war, introduce them again and talk about them. What happened to them? Yeah. And how might their wound impact you today? How might you be carrying some of that wound still? And what might you need to do? Begin to address that. Begin to heal your own personal wound. We're getting shortish of time, so Sebastian, could we have 15 minutes rather than 20 in the breakout rooms, please?
Okay.
Thank you.
15 minutes. Opening
Thank you,
rooms in 3, 2,
Thank you.
1.
Oh, we're back together again. Thank you, Sebastian. Other rooms. Yes, here we are, all together. Need to make Simon, I think you're on mute.
As ever.
There we are. That's
okay.
Great. Thank you.
Yes. So we're coming near the end of our time together. It's been a lot has happened in the last couple of hours. We'd like to very briefly hear from each of you just as a kind of check out and check in with this last exercise and a check out as to where you are, what you're going away with. But keep it, again, few words. Maybe something he's leaving behind here. And we'll have this circle and finish with a ritual. And that'll be us for the evening.
Feeling of a lid lifted.
A lid lifted. Wow.
Thank you.
I think maybe work to do or places to explore.
Thank you.
I've been touched by the openness of the people in the group I was in, and the generosity. I just felt moved moved by their experiences and their honesty, that had just opened doors that I'd not seen before. Thank you to each one of them.
Thank you, Peter.
Thank you, Peter.
I'm struggling to find the words because that's kind of what it's about, expressing the unspoken. There are no words for yet.
Right.
And I really appreciate the poetry to get me in there, because I think that really helps.
Thank you.
Yeah, I would really echo that. What we can't say, sometimes the poems can. So I'm grateful for them, grateful for this space. And as always, feeling it's not enough.
We'll come on to that, Sean.
Yes.
But thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Is it possible to have a list of the poems you read, William?
Yes. I think, John, you have a link, do you?
I do indeed.
John has a link that will get you to actual copies of the poems, all the poems I've read, which are on my website, and you're more than welcome to help yourself. So
very generous, thank you.
Very welcome. You're very welcome. Thank you for turning up. The link is just there, I think.
I keep trying to jump in. There's something about this time of year that isn't just about it being Remembrance Day today. It's the time of year when, you know, they talk about the veil between the worlds being thin, and an opportunity to connect in with our ancestors. And I feel really moved as I speak these words. Really, there's something opening, and it is beyond words. You know, that's what I said. I don't know if you heard, but when we had our last little check-in, it's about, you know, I felt moved beyond words, and now I would say there's something about an opening. You're coming into relationship with some of this, and I don't know how, but
Yeah,
but it is happening. Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you for this space. Yeah.
Thank you for those words. Thank you.
Yeah.
Yes, very powerful, powerful 2 hours, and I'm left with some quite unexpected kind of new new doors, or at least a new door to explore. Yeah, and sort of challenging questions to the self.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Like a few others, I don't know. I don't have words. I have an urge to explore. I have a curiosity to explore, and I have a kind of lump in my throat for it, but I don't have the words.
Thank you, Lee.
Thank you, Lee. I think the lump in the throat says it all.
Says it all. I was going to say.
Yeah. Yeah.
I'm conscious that whilst looking back at the past generations, I'm looking very much forward as well at the moment. In the last piece about what's needed for healing does lead us that way.
Yeah.
And I'm not exactly a cyber stalker, but can't notice that Simon has a consultancy called Two Wolves, or something similar to that, and the Cherokee legend of there's always a fight going on. Who will win depends on what we choose to give our energy to, who we feed.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you, Cran. So
we have a poem, a ritual, and a shameless plug, and a closure.
Yes. I'm going to begin with a shameless plug, if I may. We realize that there is so much more we could do. We realize there is so much more that we could add. There is so much more. There are so many more places we could go to with this, and we had prepared material for today, and what has happened, and what came up, and some of these things, big issues like the archetypal aspect of war, the sublime nature of war and terror, these kind of things. They're going to make an appearance in a workshop that we're going to be doing in February, March, called the four horsemen,
facing the four
horsemen, which is really an exploration of war, death, famine, and pestilence. These things that seem to be appearing in our lives in a way that we have been spared in many ways. And how do we, it's a men's workshop, how do we as men come to deal with these things? And it may be that you know people who might be interested. It may be that you know people that you might want to refer. But we're certainly there, and we're certainly open for meeting anyone who cares to turn up. End of shameless plug. Apologies. There we are.
How do they get information, William? Is there a link?
There is a link, and once again, I think either of our websites, and I think John has once again got a link there, which we can certainly put out, and by all means chase us up. There we are.
Okay.
And there's a special discount if you say that you were here at the workshop. So if you apply for that weekend, add a note that you were here today, and there is a little discount available.
Great. Good. Okay. Simon.
Are you going to do the poem, or are we going to do 2 minutes?
Yes. Okay. As a way of rounding out our time together, we'd like to resort to tradition, because we think tradition is one of those things that can hold a vast amount of feeling, but also it's a thing that rolls us forward into the future. So what we're going to do is I'm going to read a little excerpt from a poem, and then Simon's going to talk us through and introduce us to a little traditional ending. The piece of writing comes from Lawrence Binyon, who was one of those very popular poets who vanished without a trace after his time. But he's remembered for 4 lines, and it's read again and again, and it's almost not, he's not mentioned, but the lines live. It's an excerpt from a larger poem called For the Fallen, but it appears again and again, chipped into stone, read out at these sort of occasions. And it's a rather poignant piece, so I'm just going to read it, and then Simon's going to carry us into what goes next. They shall not grow old, as we that are left grow old. Age shall not weary them, nor the years condemn. At the going down of the sun, and in the morning, we will remember them.
So just close your eyes and take a breath. And maybe just feel your heart, put your hand on your heart. We're going to take 2 minutes in silence just to close, gather ourselves and feel what we feel. I'll ring the bell on each end.
Okay.
Thank you to everybody for showing up, taking risks, being here, opening up. Huge thanks to Sebastian and to John for looking after us as well. Go very well, go very careful.
Yes. I'm just to add one little thing. Please do take care of yourself this evening.
Yeah.
Sometimes we can be energized and excited, and I use the word advisedly in particular ways. So please do take care of yourselves. And we look forward to seeing you again. And thank you all very much indeed. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Wish you all well.
Yeah.
Thank you for being here with us. Thank you to Simon and William. Very powerful 2 hours. And I've just popped the link to the workshops in the chat room. I'll also send an email out as well.
Great. Thank you.
And Santu, thank you for your private message. Just to confirm, there isn't a code, but when you make contact, just to say about the workshop today. So, yes.
Great.
Hopefully
Yes.
that makes sense. I'm just switching off the line.